I'm just going to go through some slides if I could have your attention. So when we talk about type on maps, we'll get back to swearing at Adobe Illustrator in 5 minutes. This is the hardest part of making maps. If you look at the Harvard campus map, for instance, which is a very good campus map, you'll notice there's not a lot of type on it, which is frustrating for new people like me when I'm trying to find University Hall or the Science Center. What's the reason there's not a lot of type on maps in 2012? It's a simple reason. It's a pain in the ass. It's a pain in the ass. Type is probably the most important symbol on a map. For somebody who's not familiar with the United States, oh, that's Texas. It's this interaction between geography and typography that creates the meaning of the map. So it's really important, but it's very difficult to label maps, and it's very tedious. That's not a good enough excuse, in my opinion, not to have type on most of your maps and journal articles and so forth. You should have type on there. So I'm going to go through some basic things. But so from a graphic design perspective, typography on maps is probably the hardest kind of typography in the world. And there's a couple reasons for that. Cartographers put typography through hoops. They make it jump through hoops. There's weird, bizarre words like Massachusetts in small, tiny spaces like Massachusetts, right? And then there's these weird angles that you have to deal with when you're labeling things, like the Mississippi River. So you have this weird word at a weird angle, and it's very difficult. Other typographers just have to put stop on a big red octagon and call it a day, right? And they're done. In cartography, you have to put Massachusetts somehow in this space, and oh, by the way, make room for Springfield and Boston and whatever else. So this is very difficult. So in a way, you guys are getting your first lesson in typography maybe in the hardest realm of typography. And so it's just some of the basic things I want you to think about. When we're talking about typefaces, there's 3 kinds in terms of cartography. There's the serif, the sans serif, and then what we call display typefaces, the gimmicky typefaces. In general, going back to the National Geographic, most maps will have 2 typefaces exactly on them. And we'll get to that in a minute. One sans serif and one serif. Classic sans serif typefaces are Helvetica, Arial, so forth. But here's your weird typography lesson of the day as it relates to cartography. Does anybody know what the typographic variable x height is? X height? You do? What is that?
The height of the letter.
The height of what letter?
When you're typing?
No, it's close. It's very close. The height of the lowercase letter x in a typeface is referred to as x height. So different typefaces have different height of lowercase letters. And so really when you're talking about typography breaking down on a document, it's usually the lowercase letters that break down first in terms of legibility. Right? The capital S is going to be legible at a smaller size than the lowercase e. So as cartographers, we want large x heights because we're often really getting that Massachusetts label to be read in the smallest way possible. So large x heights, Helvetica has a very large x height, Arial does too. Those are good things. All right, so legibility on maps is another thing. So I just want to go through a couple basic things and then we're going to label this map. So the major type variables, once we're within a typeface, are size, style, and spacing. So let's say we're using Helvetica and I'm labeling states. Obviously 10, 12, 24 point, that's a variable. In general, one thing I would advocate when you're labeling all the states is try to keep that as steady as possible. Utah, Wyoming, California should all be the same type size. Type style, things like bold, italics, right? They introduce more variability, and I'll tell you when we use those. And then 2 new words for some of you will be kerning and letting that are very popular in typesetting on cartography. Kerning, when I'm labeling the continent of Asia, I can use 280 point type to get that ASIA across that entire continent. Or I can introduce kerning, which is essentially added spaces between the characters. Right? So adding spaces between the characters of words like Utah that are very short that need to cover a large expanse. And then letting, which is line spacing. So it's not just single space or double space in cartography. We adjust that in terms of point sizes. So let's get going by choosing a good typeface for our U.S. states. And we're going to start with labeling the states of the United States. So it's not very exciting, but it's very functional. Helvetica would be my first choice for labeling the U.S. states. Stay away from thin typefaces like Garamond, which are beautiful on the printed page, but break down on maps. So let's start with either Arial or Helvetica, not Comic Sans, and look at. Now I'm over on the right. So when I look at this, I want to show you guys a couple of important things to consider when you're adding map labels. And whether you listen to me or not, I hope you do. But start with the Western U.S. Okay. By the time you get to Massachusetts and Rhode Island, you'll really honed your skills, and you'll need them when you get there because these are small. But let's start with the state of Utah, which is a big space and a short word. So let's start with that. So in my Illustrator environment, I have the state type layer highlighted. That means that's the layer I'm editing. Okay? Everybody, this is a basic Illustrator thing. So it's blue, it's visible, and I see the word Texas down there. And I'm going to ignore that word Texas just for a minute, and I'm going to start from scratch. So this tool over here, type, click on that. And when I click on that, I can click anywhere on the map and type the word Utah. I'm going to use all caps.
I can't find Helvetica.
And I'm putting Utah right there.
Do you know where Helvetica is? I couldn't find it. Sorry, it's
It's
there.
not.
Okay, now here
not
is
under half.
something you guys will want to know going forward. There's a lot more to it than this. So window, I want to make sure my type window is active. I don't know why. So I'm going under the window menu and I'm choosing type and I'm choosing character. Or you can hit Control-T to activate this panel. And all of a sudden I have these options. Okay, so if I hit Control-T over and over again, my character dialog box goes away and comes there, and that's nice to know.
Do you have a favorite backup for Helvetica? I can't seem to find it.
Yeah, if Helvetica is on these machines, I would choose Arial, which is always on a Microsoft machine, because Arial is the Microsoft ripoff of Helvetica. A little typography trivia for you there. So I'm going to use Arial. I'm going to use 12 point. And guys, while I have your attention, look at these three. I'm mousing over the three things that are really important. This is type size. All right. Undergrads turn in papers with 14-point type, especially when you tell them they have to write a 5-page paper. This one over here is letting or line spacing. So for North Dakota, that will become helpful, and I'll show you that in a second. And then this one on the lower right is kerning. And so when I change this to 200, watch what happens to my label Utah. It spreads out. So now there's added space in between the U and the T and the A and the A and the H. All right, so with that label selected, I'm going to return that to 0. I'm going to change this to 10 point, and I'm going to place it in the center of the state. Now, you might be tempted to rotate that, to orient that label to the sort of natural geometry of Utah, and you can see, because of this map projection, that line of latitude that defines the southern extent of Utah. A lot of people are tempted to rotate that, so it sort of rides along that arc. I would not do that. I'd like to try to keep all of my labels, and you'll see this in National Geographic too, to try to keep them all flat. So now I want to take the easiest way for me to go and label the state to the east, Colorado, is to use copy and paste. So with this label selected, Control-C, just like in Microsoft Word, is going to copy that element that I've selected, and Control-V will paste it, in the center of my artboard or the center of my workspace. So right now I have two Utahs, and one is in the middle of, is that Kansas? Yeah. And I'm going to move it to Colorado. I'm going to click T, so I'm teaching you guys a shortcut. So to go back and forth between the select tool and the type tool, I have just the letter T. I'm going to click T, and all of a sudden my type tool is active. And I'm going to write Colorado. And then I'm going to hit the escape button, which highlights the thing I just typed. And I'm going to place it. Okay, so I'm going to repeat those steps for a couple other states so you guys can follow along. Control C, Control V, that maintains the exact style. Drag it over. Hit the T button to activate my type tool. And type the beautiful word Kansas. I hit escape, and that automatically highlights my selection tool. And now I can do Control C, Control V, and get another Kansas. And I'm going to move that over to Missouri. Escape. Okay guys, so as a professional cartographer, like you are all aspiring to be, what's wrong with that Missouri label? It's too large? Why? Yeah, it overlaps with the border. So what are the type variables I control to make that not happen now? I could make it 6 point. Now is it a good label? No. What else could I do?
To move with the, to the basic size. So, dependent on polygon form.
Yeah, I could do that. I could also, I heard kerning, that's what I want to play with here. So using my kerning tool, I can give it a negative kerning. In other words, compress those characters together so they take up less space. And you can see that now it fits barely, and that's heavily kerned. So a word about type sizes. And again, if you're designing for an online journal, or if you're designing for paper, there's a huge fork in the road with typography. The smallest typeface that's legible on a piece of paper is what, do you think? What's the smallest type you could read if we printed something out on a LaserJet printer next to it?
3 PT?
7 or 8.
7 or 8 point. Usually people say 6 point. All right, so when you're designing for print, you can get away with 6 point type labels on your map. What happens when I'm designing for the web? Does that number get bigger or smaller or stay the same?
Bigger.
Bigger. The minimum legible type on screen is always smaller, so 8 point is generally what I tell my students. So 8 point type. And why is that? Does anybody know why that happens? What is the controlling variable and why this won't happen much longer?
Pixels on the screen.
Pixels on the screen. So, you know, if you have an iPhone, you can read 6 point type on the new iPhone at 6 point, at its natural size. But you can't read 6 point on these Dell monitors because of pixel resolution on the screen. Okay, so when you're working on the Dell machine, think about where you're going with this map. And in this exercise, we're going to pretend we're making a map for the website. So we're going to say 8 point is the smallest type anywhere on this map. So I'm going to change all of my labels by selecting them all with my Shift key and making them 8 point. And I don't want that kerning on Missouri anymore. So now I can fit it. Okay, so before I turn you loose, one more thing. I want you to turn on and have the layers locked that has the capital cities that we're going to also label this morning. The city symbols. US cap. US caps layer. US caps layer, guys. Because not only are we going to label Colorado, we're going to label Denver, which is the capital of Colorado, right, Jeff?
Correct.
Thank you. And Montpelier. So the reason we turn that layer on is why. So I can play a game of chess with my design and say, okay, I know my Oklahoma label is going to have to make room for the city capital of Oklahoma, which is what, Joe?
The capital of Oklahoma.
Oklahoma City. So we're going to have Oklahoma City labeled right here. So I want to make sure my Oklahoma label is going nowhere near that. All right. So already I can see I'm in pretty good shape with Utah and Colorado. Kansas I'd probably bring down to make room for what? Huh? I think it's Topeka.
Okay.
This is a little geography test for all of us. Okay, so let's play with labeling for a while.